predictions as much, the way I see it, I really think of it as forecasting, is as much about knowing what you don't know as knowing what you do know and kind of mapping out the whole landscape.
There's a whole swatch of the country that does not agree with California and New York.
And I worry about finding the leaders who will have a positive message to draw the party in the right direction.
I think we have young people now realizing that democracy is something that you fight for.
When you share your story, you realize that my dreams are your dreams and that in so many ways, I am you.
What does it mean to be an American today? Do you have to be conservative or progressive, pro-gun or pro-gun control, for or against immigration reform? Or can we find common ground that will move our country forward before it tears apart? Tonight on the Aspen Institute Presents, we'll hear from some of America's brightest political minds on where our country goes next. Hi, I'm Hari Sreenivasan, on location at the 2013 Aspen Ideas Festival in Aspen, Colorado. This is day 3 of the week-long Ideas Festival, and we've heard from dozens of compelling speakers on a broad variety of exciting topics. There's perhaps no subject that gets lively conversations going more than American politics. Last year at the festival and all over the country, Americans were consumed with a highly contentious presidential election. For many of us, it came right down to the wire on Election Day, but there was one person who knew what the outcome would be before a single vote was cast. Not only that, statistician and prognosticator Nate Silver also correctly called the 2008 election. Katie Couric asks Nate Silver to explain exactly how he does it.
Wikipedia describes you, among other things, as a sabermetrician and a cephalogist. Two words I had to look up in the dictionary, Nate.
I don't like those words particularly, right? I think I like the English language, right? But I'm a guy who looks at data and looks at numbers just to try and understand how the world works. It's not a lot more complicated than that necessarily. In 2007, the perception, for example, was that Hillary Clinton is really inevitable and that she couldn't possibly lose, and that Rudy Giuliani was going to win the Republican nomination and so forth. And people don't realize, people think, oh, I'm the guy who always says, oh, the polls are accurate. That's not exactly right. I just say that, we can go back to history and see how accurate the polls might or might not be. In primary elections, the polling is really, really wild. Early on especially, you have 5 or 6 candidates in the field. People haven't made their decisions yet. What the polls say 6 months in advance might not mean very much. Whereas in general elections, by the time you get to October, everyone's pretty locked in. But yeah, I was frustrated by the emphasis on the narrative or on kind of who won the day is a phrase that's sometimes
the horse race aspect.
The horse race aspect, and I don't mind horse race stuff, right? I'm a sports fan. I'm a guy who's made money as a poker player or a gambler. So I don't mind the election for the election's sake. But there was a lot of coverage on what I would call the noise, irrelevant distractions that for people who are news junkies that don't really answer this question about who's actually likely to win.
And you said you turned to politics because unlike finance or sports, it had become a lazy industry, pushing a gossipy groupthink that often proved wrong. Why do you think that political reporters were so late to kind of embrace data and statistical models?
I think it's kind of an analogous case to baseball in some ways, where it's a high-profile industry, but it's pretty small. You have the 3 networks, or now the 4 networks, and that used to be kind of about it, really. And I think they did an admirable job in many ways for a number of years, but also meant that there was a certain lack of need to innovate, right? That you had to kind of pay your dues, and you get into that culture, and it's my feeling it's a bit of a cliquish kind of industry, and so people who think differently might not really be listened to exactly. But then you have kind of blogs emerging. You have simultaneously the emergence of the wide availability of polling and other types of data that's for public consumption and is not relying on insider information. It's all based on here's stuff you can download anywhere and build a model yourself.
So do you think that mainstream media didn't really know how to collect and synthesize all this new data that suddenly became available?
The tradition is that campaign desks are very reluctant to characterize who's ahead in the race. They love to say too close to call, even when it isn't. I'm not talking about election night itself. I don't mind some caution on waiting for more ballots to get in before you call a state on election night. But
Do you think to keep the race more exciting?
But yeah, so people talk a lot about, well, does the press have a liberal bias or a conservative bias? And you know, maybe it does.
Bias.
But they have a ratings bias that's much, 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 much stronger than either of those, right? You know, and you can see it very explicitly where, for example, in the debates this past year, where it became Obama had pulled way ahead after the convention and then did quite badly at the first debate, but was a little better at the second debate, and by the kind of polls, the public said Obama had won. But you had people kind of in the press saying, well, it was close enough that it's a tie, and the tie means that Romney wins, right? Because he, you know, that's the standard is lower for him. So it was kind of blatant example of that kind of hoping for the race to stay close. You also have, by the way, kind of a pile-on and groupthink bias. You know, I remember after, before the first debate, you had the 47% comments. Then you had Benghazi, which is now seen, I think maybe correctly, is kind of a problem for U.S. intelligence. But at the time, the buzz was all about how was Romney's response, right? Had Romney's response been undiplomatic, instead of thinking about the more newsworthy event of what actually happened there, and should people in the State Department have been more accountable. So that was another example where, because the mood then was so much that, Romney is collapsing, people saw that narrative and piled on that story in a way that, you know, in that case was kind of biased toward Obama, whereas it worked later in a different way, I think a couple of weeks afterward.
You have been uncannily accurate. You correctly predicted every state but one in the 2008 presidential race, Mazel. Indiana being the exception, and all 35 U.S. Senate races. You correctly predicted every state in the 2012 presidential race and 31 out of the 33 U.S. Senate races. That had to feel pretty good, especially because a lot of people, Nate, were out there talking smack about you.
On election night, well, let me preface this by saying a couple. First of all, there are other sites that did nearly as well or just as well, that were taking kind of similar approaches. If you had just taken a straight average of the polls with no kind of fancy technology applied to it, you'd have gotten 48 or 49 states right.
What happened in Indiana?
Well, in Indiana, my theory is they need a recount there. No, I'm just kidding. But one thing that can make a team with a candidate with a very strong turnout operation can overperform its polls a bit. And especially in Indiana, I lived in Chicago at the time, and every Democrat I knew, since Illinois was not a swing state, was going down to knock on doors in Gary, Indiana, and so forth. It was a state, meanwhile, that Republicans thought, we're not going to lose Indiana, right? And so I think they got 120% turnout or something in Gary, and won as a result. But look, we're not supposed to, we put these things in terms of probabilities, where it's not too hard to know that Barack Obama is going to win New York, right? To know who's going to win Colorado, I think we had Obama as an 80-20 favorite on election night. So what that means is that, yeah, you'll get that prediction right most of the time, but you're supposed to have those 20% occurrences occur now and then. So from my point of view, we've been a little bit lucky, right? And sooner or later, it's going to catch up, and so So
Well, 2010 wasn't so good, right? Wasn't as good.
2010 was, I think we missed 2 Senate races, and we're off by like 8 or 9 House seats. But we're doing it. The principle in prediction is called calibration, and what that means is that out of everything you say is a 8 out of 10 chance, then how many of those do you get right? And it should be 8 out of 10, not 10 out of 10. When the weather forecasters say there's a 20% chance of rain, that forecast is well calibrated. You might not like when the 20% occurs, but it does occur over the long run, about 2 times in 10, not a lot more, not a lot less. So that's the goal. We're not saying that we can distill voting behavior down to any type of perfect number. You're going to have some error, and the error is going to be a lot more in some types of races, much harder, as I said, to forecast primaries than general elections, much harder to forecast down ballot races for the U.S. House, for the polling might not be very good. And so it's just a way to kind of quantify, like I said, kind of what we know and what we don't know. I think in the presidential race, we probably know more from the polls than people want to let on, that say, oh, it's still a kind of too close to call horse race. But that's not always true.
You use something called the Bayesian Method, which I tried to read about and understand, and honestly, I don't think we should waste anybody's time here because it's so complicated and confusing. But when you look at voting trends or polls in swing states, what exactly, Nate, are you analyzing? I mean, tell us just sort of the whole pool of information that you go through and digest and dissect.
So we're really looking at, I think one principle of building a model is that a model is inherently a simplification of the world. Right now, it's now up to about 40% of the country now doesn't have a landline in their home.
So how inaccurate are polls because of that?
Well, they've had, I mean, some of these cheapo polls that are not calling people with cell phones have had pretty bad years. And it's one of the excuses, I guess they'd have, or not excuses, but one of the reasons why you had some polling firms missed low on Obama's numbers in 2012 is because, you know, people who don't have cell phones, right, or don't have or landlines rather, tend to be people who are younger, more urban, maybe a bit kind of lower middle class, right? So all these are democratic voting characteristics. You can try and counteract that by waiting, but it doesn't always work. And so, yeah, if you don't call people with cell phones, then you know, I'm not sure you can really kind of call your poll scientific at this point, right? Although some polls that tried to reach people on the internet did quite well. Incumbents normally get reelected. So if you have a case where the economy is a little bit below average, but not too much below average, that's kind of where the incumbent gets their mulligan sometimes. That's, I think, what happened here is people said, you know, like there's just enough progress economically that, you know, I don't really like this Romney guy that much, so kind of grit and bear it and vote for Obama instead. Then they had a good turnout operation that kind of helped their margins a little bit more in the swing states. But that was kind of the story that you know, the model. So I think we got 50 out of 50 states right on election night. I think that's was kind of not as hard as we had 49 out of 50 states right actually in June when we launched the forecast. We had Florida for Romney then instead of Obama, but just based on where the election was in this zone where the average incumbent running for re-election, the average election incumbent wins by 7 or 8 points, right? So it's a pretty large handicap that he has, and the economy was just making enough progress. The last couple of jobs reports were good that Obama kind of got over the finish line.
Why do you think? Do you think it's the same reasons that you were mentioning before about being ratings driven? Why do you think that so many political anchors, reporters kept saying that, you know, Romney was going to, even people like Frank Rich were saying that the race was too close to call and that Romney had a great chance of pulling ahead. Do you think it was to kind of gin up suspense over the campaign, or do you think there was a genuine feeling? And why? What prompted that?
I mean, there was a chance that Obama could have won, or excuse me, that Obama could have lost, right? It was certainly very close after the Denver debate. Certainly, if you're talking about June and July, we had Obama ahead, but still because there was so much uncertainty, only a 60% chance of winning. But you know, you can also go back to 2008, where the panelists on the McLaughlin group, the night before the election, when there was no doubt that Obama was going to win. He was ahead in every poll by 7 or 8 points, right, which is where the margin he won by. Even then, people were saying, oh, it's too close to call. So I think people are afraid of being accountable, right, for kind of sticking their necks out. I think there's this kind of notion of journalistic objectivity, which is complicated, but sometimes it means that, well, you just kind of say half dozen of one and 6 of the other, and you kind of decide for yourself, right? Whereas for me, it's rather biased to say that, oh, you have the vast majority of polls, and you know, in the swing states, probably 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 polls had Obama ahead in Ohio and Colorado and so forth by the end of the campaign, right? To say there are 9 of one and 2 of the other, and to call that the same, that's a biased viewpoint, I think. So I think people are trying to avoid taking sides in politics, and you know, that gets them in trouble. The good thing is that in elections in the long run, each party wins about half the time, right? So you kind of naturally wind up being neutral if you're just kind of telling the truth, basically, right? And being honest about who's going to win at a given moment in time. But that doesn't mean that every election is 50-50.
Why do you think your methodology has rankled so many, you know, political reporters? I was reading some quotes, and Joe Scarborough, Peggy Noonan, both pretty disparaging. Politico's Dylan Byers said this may shock the coffee-drinking NPR types of Seattle, San Francisco, and Madison, Wisconsin, but more than a few political pundits and reporters, including some of his own colleagues, believe Silver is highly overrated.
Well, look, I'm a competitive guy, And part of what we're saying is that a lot of these people who have jobs going on TV, and not reporters, okay, not reporters, but pundits, I think are basically useless and exist as entertainers and don't really provide any insight to what's actually going on in the real world. And we say that, less and less politely, I guess, over the course of the campaign. But so, yeah, there's a direct challenge to people's kind of careers. There's the other thing too is you get a lot of pushback from partisans. Obviously, look, you have a lot of people in D.C. Who are in the business of trying to alter reality, basically, right? And when you say, no, there is a reality here, and we're going to have a gut check, a reality check on November 6th, and here's a simple forecast of what's going to happen. That's why I say before, I don't think our models are really that complicated, right? Just saying, let's look at the state polls, look at the economy, and that's kind of it. We're not trying to have very different variables, really. We're trying to find a very good way to measure the economy and a good way to find the true signal within the polls. But conceptually, it's pretty simple. It basically boils down to, look, Obama's ahead in every poll in Ohio, so he's probably going to win. Not a lot more complicated than that, really.
Let's talk about the big surprise of the 2012 race, which was really the power of the changing demographics. Do you think people were caught off guard by that, Nate, surprisingly, or not so much?
I think, well, I don't know. I think the Romney campaign folks were clearly caught a little bit by surprise on election night. I think their feeling was that they personally disliked Obama so much. They thought, there's no way he's going to get reelected, right? And that might be a case of they're kind of talking to too many people who are like themselves and not different groups of people of different races and different social classes who might have different takes on things. So I think that's part of it. I also think there's a danger, though, to Democrats actually in becoming too complacent about this. Look, it's absolutely the case that if in perpetuity, if Democrats always win 75% of the Hispanic vote and 95% of the African American vote, unless they won 75% of the Asian vote as well, right? If those things are always true and they hold their share of the white vote, then they'll keep doing better and better. But it probably won't always be true. One thing about immigrant groups in the United States that they tend to integrate, and that groups that we once thought of as being minorities, whether they were Irish or Italian, are now thought of as being white. And also the parties are allowed to adapt themselves. You see the GOP struggling now with immigration reform, I think, but they're at least making an effort to do that. So yeah, I think people, I'm skeptical of kind of emerging majority arguments. They have a really bad track record. If you look at almost every election, right, where someone wins by more than like a point, is seen as the sign of a future wave building, when in fact there's really a lot of reversion to the mean. And as I said, over the long run, it's very hard for a party to win more than a few elections, a couple of elections in a row.
You don't have to be as good a number cruncher as Nate Silver to know that Americans remain politically divided. We'll elect a new president in 2016, but what do Republicans need to do to take back the White House? Some observers point to a GOP moving further from the center. Conservatives and the Tea Party have certainly gained influence. How will the GOP build internal consensus on what it stands for? And who's poised to lead the charge? Our next session takes on those questions.
It seems to me one of the greater phenomena in our party since the election has been the emergence of Rand Paul as a serious national figure. Is Rand Paul libertarianism consistent or compatible with kind of communitarian conservatism, even of the type that Ronald Reagan emphasized when he talked about family, work, community, and church? Are these incompatible visions in your mind?
Yes.
All right, on to you, Karl.
I think that there
Could you elaborate?
I think there are significant ideological tensions within the Republican Party that come to fundamental matters of governing vision. And those work themselves out in the primary process. This has been dubbed the Libertarian Moment, and there's a lot of truth to that. Rand Paul is a very effective politician, very different from his father. Rand Paul really represents libertarianism without the edge of looniness, and he's very effective at speaking into events to support a very strong ideological perspective. And there are a lot of events now that are conspiring in a liberal or a libertarian direction. Everything from exhaustion with global commitments, which I think are broadly shared by Americans, whether we head towards a crash with fiscal easing, which I think has been a traditional libertarian critique about money. Also, we have recent events that seem to be conspiring to confirm conspiracy theories, whether it's the IRS or the NSA or the FBI with domestic drones or other things. I think the reaction to this is often just wildly overblown, but it fits the libertarian narrative very, very well. But let me just say, the question is what the Republican Party, the policy problem the Republican Party needs to solve. We can develop it more, but I think the Republican Party has a serious problem with working class voters who are in an economy that's continually stagnant for them, no matter what the situation is in the broader economy, and with new Americans that are concerned about social mobility.
That leads to a question. Again, I want to focus on policy, the policy rationale for the Republican Party. If I were a Democrat, I would listen to all that and I'd say, well, that's good enough as far as it goes, but the real answer to the question is the Republican economic message has been fundamentally discredited. We had a collapse of the economy under a Republican administration in 2008, and we've recovered from that very substantially by massive governmental interventions in the economy. First, the TARP program under President Bush, then an $800 billion stimulus program under President Obama, the Fed with quantitative easing these last few years. Doesn't this all prove that, and now the economy is growing again, we're actually adding jobs, stock market's rising. Doesn't this fundamentally discredit the Republican economic model? And the answer is not a different Republican model. The answer is vote for the Democrats.
I don't think so at all.
Oh, good.
I disagree with I disagree with your initial observations. Number one, I don't think the Republican model, this economic model, is that is discredited. It's being questioned. Yes, there's no question about that. I would also dispute that the economy is coming back. The unemployment rate is 7.6%. About 180,000 jobs, net jobs, have been created in the last month. It is well below the 225 to 250,000 net new jobs that need to be created every month just to keep even with population growth. The unemployment rate also at 7.6, as high as it is, also masks the fact that the labor participation rate is actually quite low. From the years 2001 to 2008, the labor participation rate was about 67.7%. Now, with a higher unemployment rate, the labor participation rate is actually about 63.4, 63.7. So we have a lot of discouraged American workers who have exited the workforce, who cannot find jobs. So the real question is, given the sharp decline in the economy in 2008, given all the fiscal stimulus, why has the economy not bounced back more quickly? Because in all past recessions, when there's been a deep drop in the economy, the bounce back has been sharp and quick, and we're not seeing that. GDP growth in the last quarter was still very, very poor. So the question is, what is holding back the full recovery of the natural dynamism of this recovering, of this economy that should be recovering? And you can have a lot of discussions about that. From my point of view, it is a tremendous amount of taxation that is present and in the future, which is casting a pall over employers who are concerned about the Affordable Health Care Act, Dodd-Frank, that's imposing tremendous restrictions on banks and freezing liquidity, and also the huge avalanche of regulations that is emanating from every single federal agency in this administration. So too much taxation, too much regulations, in fact, are showing directly their results on an economy that's not bouncing back as quickly as it should.
Karl, I want you to synthesize these last two comments. We've got,
Oh, great.
We've,
yeah.
We've got Mike Gerson saying the Republican Party needs to have a message that addresses the problems of stagnant incomes, lack of social mobility, genuine problems of working class people, and that Rand Paul's libertarianism is not consistent with that. And Elaine's just told us basically that the problems with our economy are that are too much government, regulation, taxation, and spending. Address that division.
Yeah. You know, what they've tended to do on issues in which there's this, what Grover Norquist calls the Leave It Alone coalition, there's some elements where people just want the government out of their lives. But are we going to, when it comes to health care, are we going to simply say, no, we want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, or do we want to say we want to replace it? We want, libertarian ideas, people ought to be able to choose health savings accounts, allow people to buy health insurance across state lines, let small business people join together and pool at risk so that they can get the same discounts the big boys get. These are sort of things that have a libertarian flavor to them, but it's going to require a prudent leadership among libertarian Republicans that says we want to find answers. And what we got right now is we got most libertarians who say, if I don't have a 100% perfect answer, I'm voting no.
If you're Karl Rove in the next election, what's the platform you want your candidate to run? Just give bullet points. What are 2 or 3 policy-related things that we all understand? There's negative sides to campaigns, and there's tactics, and there's technology, but every candidate really wants to talk about something. That's my experience. Candidates want to talk about what they're going to do if they get elected. What would you tell a candidate, if you were the campaign manager, that he or she should run on as a basic platform on economic and domestic policy going into the 2014 election?
I think Republicans have a disadvantage, and I'm sure those in the audience have heard this, and some will agree and some will not. I come from Kentucky. I lived in New York. I've lived in California. And there are people, believe it or not, there's a whole swatch of the country that does not agree with California and New York. And they're actually quite vocal, and increasingly so. I think it's interesting, and we've got to put it in perspective. All the parties, both parties, if you take the long-term point of view, there will be differences. And there will be ups and downs in fortune. I think the Republican Party is looking at itself very, very seriously, very intently. I think Republicans felt very intensely the loss of 2012, so that they know that something needs to be done. But as we've just heard here, there's a lot of different opinion as to what is really going on. As for me, and because I'm focused on jobs and employment, I think that is still very relevant. In all the polls, that is still the #1 issue. It may recede here and there, but it's an overwhelming issue, and I think Karl will address that as well. We need to speak about these issues with compassion. And sometimes the Republicans do not speak with a voice of compassion. And I think that needs to be improved. I think there needs to be more outreach to groups of color. We're not doing that. But I think the economic message is still pretty set. But that's also the advantage and the problem, because how many times can you talk about tax cuts? How many times can you talk about taxations, regulations, and too much spending? The message is simple, but it gets kind of boring after a while, even though it is totally true. Yeah. So I think I'm in no position to offer advice. You've got much greater minds here.
That's pretty good advice, actually. Mike,
I think just, the basics, and you have to say it in a way that's appealing, and there has to be much more outreach to the people that we're trying to reach.
I mean, in an essay that I did with Pete Wehner for commentary, we said, why don't you take on the concentration of power in the big banks or corporate welfare or other things to symbolize that you're not on the side of a corporate culture, that you're actually on the side of individual entrepreneurship and social mobility and other things. Libertarians are concerned about 2 million people in prison, okay, as vast mass incarceration. Evangelicals have a humanitarian concern through ministries and others with prisoners. Liberals are concerned about the racial implications. Why can't Republicans pick some issues like that show we're different, we're changing, perfectly within the bounds of our coalition, perfectly within the bounds of our ideology, but show the kind of creativity that says, we get it, we're shifting and changing. I'll just conclude by saying, parties win when they come to the point where you say, we're tired of losing.
Look, Rand Paul is doing this. When Rand Paul stands up and says, we need to go campaign in the Latino community, the Hispanic community, we need people with tattoos, it strikes a hopeful note among people who may not agree with his views on foreign policy, for example. So I think one of the things is that in 2000 we constantly had this conversation. People would say, well, that's sort of risky by having Bush emphasize compassion and conservatism. No, it isn't, because people rallied to it. And I remember after the election, we were, Clinton saw Bush. He said, George, when you said that compassionate conservative thing, I knew we were in deep trouble. He said, that was just brilliant, because I knew when you keep your people and be evil, eat and some ours, that was brilliant, just brilliant. But on the 17th of June, Mike wrote this: religious conservatives, for example, are the single largest constituency within the GOP and compose about a quarter of the entire electorate. Such voters are not baggage thrown overboard to lighten the ship, they're planks in the hull, which I thought was a really important insight. And Mike later goes on to say that what's required is imaginative leadership. A Republican reformer cannot use religious conservatives as a foil. He or she will need to appeal to religious conviction as a motivation for reform. And that ain't easy to do. To find a way to take the base of the Republican Party and lead it in a way that allows us to expand the numbers without sacrificing first principles, but making ourselves accepting to current circumstances.
Eric Cantor is going to be here, I don't know, today or tomorrow, doing a panel. What would you say that Eric should advise his caucus and his candidates to talk about in the next election?
Well, there's a fundamental previous decision you have to make. The question right now is, does the Republican Party need to motivate its coalition or modify its coalition? Now, you always have to motivate your coalition when you're going to an election. That's necessary. You can't get rid of it and start over. The question is whether they need to modify it in some significant ways. I think there are good reasons they need to. Demographic change, generational change, the problems with working class voters. That, for me, requires a governing vision that includes everyone. Okay? That it does outreach to even people you know aren't going to vote for you. Because it shows you care about the whole. You're not representing a faction within your own coalition. You're representing the country and its needs. It's the reason when we were involved in a campaign in 2000, when one of the president's first, candidate Bush's first speeches he gave, he specifically criticized the idea that politics has no higher purpose, no greater goal than leave us alone. That was a criticism that we made to prove this point.
That's a criticism you snuck into the speech. We could have been a little bit more artful in that one speech, making our point.
Right. But so governing vision matters. But then the Republican Party has to overcome, I think, through symbolic policy, needs to communicate, we get it. We know there's a problem here. And the problem on immigration, just to be blunt about it, is not that Republicans have not done enough outreach in the last couple of decades. It is that an element of the party has set out to alienate, positively alienate the Hispanic community in Proposition 187 under Pete Wilson, in the Arizona law, in defeating the Bush comprehensive immigration reform, in talking about self-deportation. The message here, that requires some kind of shock therapy. It has to say, we understand that this has been on the wrong track. That's the reason that immigration reform, I think, is an important symbol for the Republican Party.
Winning over more minority voters will be one of the GOP's biggest challenges in coming years. But do elections always have to be about slicing up the electorate into factions that swing toward one party or another? Our next session will ask if it's time for a new definition of what it means to be an American citizen, one that defies traditional left-right divides.
We're in a remarkable moment, not just because the immigration bill is on the floor and we're in the midst of this debate, but for a variety of reasons. This week's Supreme Court decisions, what's been going on over debate about the NSA and about government and its relationship to citizens, the IRS scandal, all these things that are forcing us and giving us both opportunity and obligation to reflect on what does it actually mean to be a citizen. Citizenship is a status under law that some people have and some people do not, but it's also a set of norms and ethics and values. It's a way of being and showing up for one another. It's also a set of privileges and immunities, to use the language of the Constitution, a bundle of rights. right? But we don't talk so much about the ways in which citizenship is also a bundle of responsibilities. And that's a thread and theme that we're going to bring out in this conversation. But in this moment right now where that word, which even 5-10 years ago had kind of a musty 50s eat your vegetables feel to it, now it's hot. It is front and center right now. People are actively worrying and thinking and reckoning with what it means to be a citizen in this moment. And so my first question for all of you to speak to is, in this moment, given this time that we're in, how do you define, or would you redefine, citizenship here in the United States?
Thank you, Eric. It's a good question, and I'll say we started thinking more and more about this recently in light of the immigration fight and in light of what the Dreamers were doing around the country. And if we said citizenship, most people in our world thought legal status, right? And we thought, well, wait a minute, it's more than that. And it's really about, if you call yourself an American, regardless of your status, if you call this place home, then it's your role and obligation to make this country work for you. And as an organizer of young people, 18 to 29 years old, I think we have a real opportunity to redefine what it means right now. I try to get these young people fired up about all sorts of issues and try to get them engaged. But the thing that they've been most passionate about over the last handful of years was the Arab Spring. And it was seeing young people like themselves fighting, losing their lives in many cases, to have a democracy that really hit home. And we started to see this incredible solidarity and people posting things and getting engaged and wanting to do more with our organization as a result. And so, I think we have young people now realizing that democracy is something that you fight for, this concept of self-rule, but we have to expand that definition further right now to also include that it's something you have to keep working at. As one of our partners in this work, the Mikvah Challenge, likes to say, democracy is not a noun, but in fact it's a verb. And so as we redefine citizenship for young people today, it's not just about participation, it's not about voting, it's not about status, but it's about making this country work for you.
That's the same spirit, it sounds like, Mark, that Citizens for Self-Governance are really activated by, this idea of self-rule.
It is, and I did come out of the Tea Party movement, and that is what drove the Tea Party movement. It was a sense of disconnect from our system of governance. And the statistics are different than what folks in the media will tell you about the Tea Party movement. Roughly 27% of members of the Tea Party movement are either Democrats or independents. And so it's over a quarter of people in that movement. And they're not there because they're right-wingers, and they're not there because they're Republicans. They're there because they felt that whoever they voted for, however they participated in democracy by voting, they weren't getting what they voted for. And it seemed, and I can tell you as somebody on the right, though not a Republican, I felt like whoever I voted, I wasn't getting what I voted for. And I travel around the country and I ask a set of questions, whether I'm in front of a progressive audience, a liberal audience, a conservative, or a Tea Party audience. I always ask people a similar set of questions, and I get the same answer. Questions like, who in the room voted for continuing $1 trillion deficits? You guys can go ahead and raise your hand. Yeah, see, I haven't found that person in America yet. And so that begs the question, if you're not voting for it, if I'm not voting for it, if none of us are voting for it, then why are our representatives continuing to do it? And that shows a disconnect between the citizen and the government. And what we see is the closer that government gets to the citizen, the greater the connection. Congressional approval ratings are at an all-time low right now. It's amazing they keep going lower, and you think they can't get any lower. But if you look at local government, on average, approval ratings for local government, city and county government, runs 60% plus. And so what that shows is when people feel like they can actually engage with their governance system, self-govern, and participate, that they're pretty satisfied with the results. So for us, sort of redefining citizenship means defining it down. It's not voting for your congressman, it's being engaged in governance at the local level.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about how some of that very local problem solving on issues like criminal justice, for instance, allow you to build very unlikely right-left alliances and coalitions. But Christina, for you, your work is nothing but, in a sense, redefining citizenship. What does this mean to you?
Exactly. Thanks for having us here. I'm very happy to be here representing immigrant youth and dreamers in this conversation. And I think that for us, we're actually doing that. And we have been doing that for the past decade of organizing and sharing our stories as someone who is an immigrant and who grew up undocumented in New York City. we are redefining citizenship and expanding the concept of citizenship because it's beyond the place where you were born. I was born in Ecuador, so I'm an Ecuadorian citizen, but all of the values that I embrace are the values that I learned here in America. And I see myself as an American, and I don't have, a paper that says I'm an American citizen. And many of the dreamers don't either. But what we have really done is we are exercising citizenship by being engaged, by fighting for our rights, by holding politicians accountable, even though we don't have the right to vote. And so it really comes down to, I think, a responsibility of contributing and a responsibility for the common good of not only immigrant communities, but the rest of our community in America. And I think it's about understanding that citizenship is beyond just having the right to vote, right? It's about engagement. It's about being part of the political process. And what you have seen with Dreamers is that, it doesn't matter if we don't get to elect our Congress members or our senators. We have gone to their offices and say, I am your constituent, and this is my story, and this is why you should care about immigration reform. And so I think for us, we have been redefining the issue of citizenship and what citizenship means to us. And we believe ourselves as Americans, although we don't have a paper to show that we are, and we were not born in this country. And as we think of the impact of potential immigration reform, I think that we get into more interesting thinking about how we will continue to redefine citizenship in the U.S.
This question right now, EJ, is front and center as we debate in the context of immigration reform this idea of a pathway to citizenship. We spent a lot of time talking about that pathway, how long it should be, what you need to do to get on that pathway, but we haven't talked so much about the destination itself, right? About citizenship itself and what it takes to reinvigorate that. Those of you who might have been here earlier this week, EJ was part of a thing that happened here called the Franklin Project, an initiative that grew out of last year's Ideas Festival, promoting an idea of national service, trying to spark a national movement around national service. And EJ, for you, this question of citizenship, maybe it's not about redefining, but just simply returning to an older sense of citizenship.
Right, we were talking about that. By the way, just for the record, I actually did vote to add $8 trillion to the deficit because I think if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have ended an economic downturn where everyone had lost their purchasing power. So, and I wish we had done it, but we're not here to argue about deficit, although I'd be happy to. Let me just, you asked an interesting question and what you talked to us about it before. What is citizenship? And to me, it's to share in the joys and burdens of self-government and to understand the obligation to balance your own legitimate interests with the common good. And that is what democratic citizenship, or what citizenship in a democratic republic is all about. And my favorite quotation on this actually comes from the philosopher Mike Sandel, who many of you are familiar with. And Mike once said, when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. And I think that really speaks to the idea of citizenship as a concept of things we do together and not simply things we do on our own, even when they are creative and productive things.
When you have severe structural inequality of the kind that we have today, it just becomes, as a simple fact, harder for many more people to engage in civic life. But the other dimension of inequality, which I think your work speaks to, is the sense that too many of the decisions are being made by a small elite, and that the elite in politics, in public life, this is across party, this is across a region, have, in a sense, rigged a game, right?
Oh, I agree. And that, and to answer the market choice question, I think what's the alternative? And today, the alternative to market choice is choice by a small ruling elite that's mostly disconnected from the rest of the population. I spend very little time in Washington, D.C., and a lot of time in places like Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Grass Valley, California. And what I find is that the people in those places look at the people in Washington like they're aliens, and vice versa. And we watch speeches of these people on TV talking about the recession has ended, and my friends sit around and ask, where will I find a job and how will I buy groceries for my children? I go to Washington, D.C., I see more construction cranes in Washington, D.C. than I've ever seen in any city in my life. Lamborghini of North America just put its North American headquarters in there, and the main complaint is too many folks who want to pay cash for Lamborghinis. More lobbyists employed than ever before. 7 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in the Beltway around Washington, D.C. So it's right now, the choice we have is market choice versus choice of people who are enriching themselves at the expense of the rest of us.
Heather, so much of you were describing earlier when we were kind of prepping for this conversation how there are so many in the millennial generation who, regardless of party, are just, for reasons maybe Mark is describing, just dubious and skeptical of politics as politics, right? But are still trying to find ways to do essentially politics by other means. What are you seeing happening with the young people you're working with at Rock the Vote?
I think most young people today pretty much believe that those in power really don't want us to be better citizens. And in fact, they're doing a lot of things really well to keep us away from the political system. And they're quite disgusted by the partisan bickering and the distrust of politicians actually solve the problems that they face every single day. And these are real problems, right? These are students on average graduating with $25,000 worth of debt. And yet we have on Monday the opportunity to double those student loan interest rates, and still no action has been taken on that. What kind of faith do you have in your political leaders when they aren't taking action to solve your problems? So what we've seen instead is them turning to themselves. It's not that they don't care anymore, it's that they're trying to find solutions on their own. I heard this great stat the other day that more young people funded themselves through Kickstarter and generated more money for the arts last year than the National Endowment of the Arts gave away. That is young people being entrepreneurial and finding solutions to the problems that they face each day.
That's free market.
That's free market. But I do also fear that that keeps them away from engaging in their government, which in the long run will only make their situation worse.
So this goes to Christina. I mean, you know, you embody a fact of American history. American political history is a story in which outsiders come in to remind insiders what the creed was supposed to mean, right? That's from the beginning, right? Whether you're talking about the Irish arriving in America, you're talking about the civil rights movement, you're talking about today the immigrant rights movement. And for you, this, you know, in order to be coming from the outside into the inside, you know that this is not just about sloganeering. You're actually learning the machinery of government. You're learning how policy is made. You're learning about markups of, you know, bills and committee and Senate and so forth. So a lot of things that you know, many others in your generation are saying, that's a waste of my time, you're actually doubling down on to get smart on. How do you spread a message, whether to other dreamers or to just, you know, native-born American young people, that no, it matters that you understand the rules of the game so that they won't be rigged against you or be made without regard to you?
Yeah, well, you know, what has worked for us is that we have actually achieved victories by organizing and taking action and getting engaged. So for us, we can say the reason why you want to get engaged and we want to share our stories as undocumented immigrant youth and families, and we want to get engaged in the political process, and you know, like it's being like a whole roller coaster to be part of the markup in the Judiciary Committee and understanding all of the inside game that happens in the Beltway, but also understanding the power that we have outside of the Beltway in educating others and empowering young people to do that. And you know, after organizing over 10 years, the immigrant youth movement reached the most significant victory in the immigrant rights movement, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that protects some young people from deportation. And when that happened, young people felt like, oh, wait, I'm not a voter, I'm not a citizen, but sharing my story, coming out, getting engaged, doing all those lobby visits, writing all of those letters, knocking on doors to get out Latino voters in New Mexico, in Florida, in Nevada, all of that worked.
I just want to say, this is a discerning audience here, but maybe for some people who are watching us stream live, I just want to explain what we mean when we say dreamer. These are activists fighting for a bill called the DREAM Act, which would have given young people born here, I mean, not born here, who are undocumented here, but were brought here by their families as children, a pathway to citizenship, either through service in the military or going to higher education. And so that was the origin of the idea of dreamers.
And it was really something that we reclaimed, because otherwise, you know, media and otherwise, when I was 19, in newspapers, I will be giving interviews about my story, and I was cited as the illegal student.
Right.
I was the illegal. I was the illegal alien. And so for us, we needed to find a way in which we could really create a shared identity within immigrant youth that I was not going to make you feel like the other and the alien. So that's why Dreamer came about as the term that we use.
EJ, one of the most formative books I ever read, actually, in my political life is one of EJ's, I'm not sure if it's your first or your earliest book, Why Americans Hate Politics, which I think was 1991.
Yeah.
And is still as fresh today. I urge you to get it. And one of the reasons why is that EJ was describing what he called the politics of false choices, right, which we still live with today, even more amplified. And the most basic false choice that you were describing in that book, EJ, was that, you know, that to be American, to be a citizen, is to understand that there are these tensions all the time between federal and state, right? Between individualism and collective action, between you know, what we do in order to kind of be free for ourselves and what we do to plan for the future, and that to actually engage in civic life is to recognize that you can't make a false choice between these things. Do you feel like, you know, 20-some years after that book, that our political civic culture, when it comes to thinking about not our politicians, just us as citizens, do you think we are worse off or better off in terms of our disposition to think beyond that binary?
This false choice concept, I mean, the last book I wrote was called Our Divided Political Heart, and it was very much about the false choice between liberty and community. And I think to understand us as people, going right back to the founding, you have to understand that we have always valued individualism and liberty. There I would have no argument with Mark at all. But we have also believed in and questioned after community, and that liberty itself depends upon strong communities.
Christina, I mean, the Dreamers, the immigrant rights movement more broadly, has been one of the most successful, one of the most emotionally moving exercises in activating empathy that we've seen in modern politics in a long time. And I'm wondering for you, just at the personal level, not even necessarily as orchestrator of all of this you know, political action, at a personal level, how have you gone about trying to create that sense of empathy when you encounter people who come into the game and the conversation saying, you're an illegal, come into the conversation saying, you know, I have an idea, let's deport you, right? How do you actually create a bridge of empathy where they may still want to delay or defer forever that pathway to citizenship, but at least they'll be able to imagine what it's like to be you?
I think it's about my story. And I think it comes a lot down to what you're getting out of these living room conversations, which is when you share your story, what's your passion, where you come from, what do you do, how are you contributing to your community, you realize that we have a lot of things in common, and that my dreams are your dreams, and that in so many ways, I am you. I am you. And so when we get to that, I think it's really hard for someone, and I had many friends and colleagues in college who were Republican, identified themselves as Republican, and they didn't know I was undocumented, I was closeted. So I wasn't sharing, I was undocumented, and so I had many friends, and we were running for student government. And when they found out that I was undocumented, I thought I was going to be rejected, and that was my personal struggle, coming out and feeling like people were going to reject me, and it didn't happen because they had realized, getting to know me and my story, that I was like them, that I had dreams like them, that I wanted to pursue different things, go to college, graduate, and that really, it makes all the difference.
We could literally have this conversation all afternoon, and I just want to close as our time comes to an end with a simple charge, actually, to all of you. This has been a great conversation. You all have asked great questions and put some great comments in there. But the question for all of us here is, what are we going to do? What is within the ambit of our power to do to revitalize citizenship in the United States, right? And we've heard in the course of the last hour several different great overlapping conceptions of what it means to show up as a citizen, whether it's strictly in electoral politics and the workings of government, whether it's more at the level of service and community, whether it's trying to mobilize money in new ways, and whether it's about trying to reinvigorate the way we teach the very nature of citizenship and self-government and democracy. No matter what your angle of entry is, everybody here has a way to engage here. And let me put it a different way. Everybody here has an obligation We can't come out of a conversation like this and say, that was great, I'm going to go to the planetarium now, right? What we have to do is think, what am I going to do? What am I going to pledge literally to myself, if not to the person I came into this room with, to do to reinvigorate citizenship just a notch? It might be in my neighborhood, in my city, it might be in Houston, it might be at a national level. And if a room like this can make that kind of commitment, we will set forth the kind of civic social contagions that everybody here has been talking about and embodies. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation, and pass it on.
The Aspen Ideas Festival has always been about bringing people together to find common ground and solutions to our most pressing issues and human challenges. We'll continue to bring you the best of the 2013 festival every night right here on World Channel. You can also watch sessions and episodes online at worldchannel.org or aspenideas.org and join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Aspen Institute Presents. I'm Hari Sreenivasan. Thanks for watching, and we hope you'll join us for more from the 2013 Aspen Ideas Festival in the coming week.